was like, shit.
Alright, we're live.
Hello and welcome back to the Hoppean Book Club after a 1-week hiatus. We will be starting the Hello and welcome back to the Hoppean Book Club after a 1-week hiatus. Okay, what the hell is happening? We will be starting the Okay, there we go. I was getting some feedback on my end.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So we will so we're starting up the anti-capitalist mentality this week. We'll be going through the introduction, chapter 1, and the first section of chapter 2 to help even out how many pages a week we're doing. Taylor could not be here this week, so sad noises.
Oh yeah, I forgot he was supposed to.
Yep. So, yeah, it's just us three again. I'm Colton.
I'm Emo.
And I'm Kyle.
Yep, you should be able to see us on the top left-hand corner of the video. Our Twitter handles on top right-hand corner. And I do not see a chat, so I can't even see if anyone is trying to chat with us.
The chat only really shows up when people send messages, so yeah.
No, I mean on Twitter itself. Like, everything is grayed out for some reason.
Oh, I'll just send the message here so we can test it out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, everything's grayed out. It's like the channel name is grayed out. The subscription button is grayed out. Title's grayed out. How many people are watching is grayed out.
I see 4 on my phone. 5.
Yeah, to me it says 2 right now, but it's probably a little bit.
Now it just went to 1.
F.
I'm looking on my phone anyway. Since my TV is at the other house anyway. So.
Yep. Okay. So this podcast is to go over various economics and libertarian books. It's for people to read and follow along. We want a discussion with the chat, so post questions. Hopefully someone else is looking at the chat, because I can't even see anything.
I am, don't worry.
We also want suggestion of books with the theme being Austrian economics and libertarianism. Other schools of libertarianism will be covered in the future, but we will do that after getting the main books of the Austrian school done. We have a theme for this next year that we're going to be doing, but if we get a good suggestion that is outside of that theme, we'll probably do it sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
So the theme for this next year is going to be Mises. So we're doing the anti-capitalistic mentality as an introduction to Mises. We're thinking that the next book beyond this will be Socialism, a Sociological and Economic Analysis. And so we're just going to go through some Mises books for a year and basically learn from the beginner of praxeology. So that's going to be fun and interesting.
Yeah. So this book that we're starting today is I guess not one of his main works. It's a pretty short book, and I guess that's why we decided to start with it. It's just a quick and easy book to digest.
We started with this book because so many times when you're reading Hoppe, he will point back to the anti-capitalistic mentality. And so if you really want to understand other Austrian works, especially Rothbard and Hoppe, you need to understand this book.
Yeah. There is an episode of the podcast Human Action with Jeff Deist where they talk about this book. And, well, you can look it up if you want to watch that episode, but essentially they have a guest in that episode. What's his name again, Colton? I'm sorry.
Patrick Newman.
Yeah. And, well, in the beginning of the episode, where they're introducing the book, they're discussing the basic concepts of it, he mentions that this was one of the books that finally made him give up Marxism entirely. And while that's great, and, it's a very good book, it's, I guess, as most of Mises' books are, not to say all of them, but it's not really a book that, at least so far, I would recommend to anyone who isn't already fond of Austrian economics, or at least somewhat knowledgeable of Austrian arguments and Austrian methodology, because a lot of the things that Mises talks about in this book, especially in the beginning, they are things that lack justification, because they are arguments that have already been made over and over again by him. So, he mentions things that are not, and doesn't really give a thorough explanation for them, because to most people who are into Austrian economics, those things are already taken for granted almost. So a lot of it feels like almost insults to socialists and fascists and Marxists and etc. And they very much are, because he's basically calling them out and giving them the reason why they adopt such ideologies.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even so much say that they'll they can be perceived as insulting, as they just plainly are insults. As we're going to go into, he's basically calling many anti-capitalists of just having envy of their betters.
Yeah, and he goes into this a lot in the book. In this first chapter, he goes into several examples. He talks about several different types of people, past and present, various, layers of society, and why they all, or at least part of these layers, end up, shifting towards egalitarian economics.
Yep.
So I think we can get started on the actual chapter now, because talk about all of these examples that he gives and all of these arguments. But yeah, I think just an important thing to mention is that this is more a book about sociology than economics.
Right, and so this is a great thing that Mises does, is that he doesn't quote-unquote stay in his lane. He branches out to sociology from economics, and this should be obvious to anyone who actually understands praxeology, that praxeology is not just a method for analyzing economics, but it's about sociology in general, and so you can fairly easily make some conclusions about human nature from praxeology.
Yeah.
But let's get to the book. Actually, we've done enough talking about it. The intro is about talking about how many people have a bias and bigotry against capitalism. And so he starts off by saying the substitution of pre-capitalist methods with laissez-faire capitalism has multiplied population figures and raised the standard of living. Still, many, especially amongst the intellectuals, see capitalism as being nothing but misery. They see man as being far better off before the Industrial Revolution. The masses are starving paupers, exploited by the rugged individualists, and profits are made by producing societal ills, not good and productive things. Such as, these would be things such as alcohol, heroin, the various rom-coms that you see in the movie theaters, just general trash forms of entertainment.
Yeah, just basically consumerism and, giving preference to futile goods and consumption rather than, I guess, things that are actually, moral and productive and beneficial to society as a whole. But yeah.
Right, and so we won't. So they basically say that.
Just before we get far into this argument and start giving out the examples, there's just one more thing that I think it's very important to mention, which is that this book was published in 1956, so it's not a particularly new book. It's been out for well over 50 years, and one thing that I've noticed from this first chapter and a lot of the beginning of the second chapter is that there are things in this book that have aged incredibly well, things that are arguments that he makes, which by now have been proven exactly correct because they've gotten worse and worse to the point where it's almost impossible to deny them. But there are also things that, if Mises had seen what the West would be like today and written the book in hindsight, which of course it's impossible, but just, if he had done that, there would have been things which he would have emphasized more because they weren't such big problems back then, or not problems at all, and then they would become problems later on, and I'm going to talk about this more specifically when we get to that. But, just I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not a new book. It's a fairly old book, and a lot of the examples, a lot of the things that he talks about are not necessarily exactly the same today, but a lot of them are still very accurate.
Right. This is why I didn't use examples from the book, but was just making up examples off the top of my head. Is because the types of things that were going around in the 1940s and 1950s are not the kinds of things that are going around today. We're going to see a great example of that in one of the sections in chapter 1. The quote-unquote cousins, because you don't really see too much of that today, but it is a old Europe thing, and you definitely, and because Mises is a man of old Europe, the he knows some problems with it. But let's continue on with the introduction.
Yeah.
So they would say that the ideological superstructure of capitalism is a literature of decay and degradation. The bias and bigotry of public opinion manifests itself most clearly in the fact that it attaches the epithet capitalistic to things abominable, never to things everyone approves of. It is the task of this essay to address the anti-capitalistic bias.
Yep.
So it's quite interesting to me that he basically is able to, in one sentence, just explain why so many people see capitalism as a bad thing. Is just they just attach capitalistic to everything that everyone obviously doesn't like, and this never applies it to things people approve of.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's a pretty short book, so the introduction is also pretty short. There's not much to talk about here. besides
It's also
what
kind
I've
of
already said.
It's also kind of interesting that Mises has these essays that are over 100 pages long.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, it's kind of funny, at least to me, because it's just like, oh, this is an essay. Wow, that's
yeah.
puts
I
my
was
essays to
writing
shame.
that one essay about economics that I started like over a year ago, and it was like what maybe 20,000 words. So it's long, but it's not a book. Um, and I was reluctant to even call it an essay just because it was over like 10,000 words. I just didn't know what to call it.
Yep. But yeah, apparently this is an essay.
Yeah.
Okay, so to get on to chapter 1 of this essay, chapter 1 is entitled The Social Characteristics of Capitalism and the Psychological Causes of Its Vilification. This is kind of what Kyle meant by it is a sociological book. Like it goes into sociology because it's not just talking about economics here, it's also talking about psychology as well.
Yeah, it's he's explaining the, I guess, sociological or the social conditions, both collectively and individually, that make individuals prone to adopting certain left-wing economic beliefs. So while the main topic of the book is surrounding economics, a large part of the point that he's making is not about economics itself, but rather what influences individuals and organizations to take up certain beliefs.
Mm-hmm. So the first section is called The Sovereign Consumer. Capitalism deproletarianizes the common man and elevates him to the rank of bourgeois. The common man is the sovereign consumer whose buying or abstinence from buying tells producers what and how much to produce. Big business must serve directly or indirectly the masses. Businesses that serve a expensive, a certain clientele, luxury goods and such, will always be subservient to mass consumption.
Yeah.
And so outside the sabotage of the nostrums of governments and politicians, the profit system makes those men prosper who have succeeded in filling the wants of the people in the best possible and cheapest way. Under capitalism, the common man enjoys luxuries that not even the richest men a few centuries ago had.
Yeah, so what he's basically saying is that, this is even more visible now than it was back then, and it's basically saying that the class struggle of Marx's era just doesn't exist anymore, because even people among the lowest, I guess, economic classes nowadays, most of them live in comfort in basically all of Western, Northern, and I guess Southern Europe, and America, and that wasn't the thing. So there were obviously a lot more problems when socialism came about and when Marx wrote his works, and a lot of those problems just don't exist anymore. So that kind of class struggle just doesn't really translate to the time period in which we were talking about, which is the 20th century.
Yep.
And that's what he means by elevating the individual to a bourgeois, which is people are not just serfs anymore like they were in feudalism, or not just workers like they were in early, I guess, industrial revolution era, or the overall abandonment of, I guess, farming and just being rural areas and the rise of cities and etc.
Right, and I finally got the live chat working on my end, so I can finally see it. Hi, Jackson.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Yep. So, so the next section is the urge for economic betterment. As soon as some wishes are satisfied, other wishes spring up. This is actually a statement that, unless you've studied economics, especially Austrian economics, you won't really understand. As soon as you satisfy some want, as soon as, let's say, an iPad is made and therefore you can more comfortably surf the web or do whatever you do on an iPad, you want more things to, there's always something else you want to do. And so it's not so much just a, oh, here's, you need shelter, you need food, you need water. It's not just like covering bare essentials. As soon as you've covered a certain desire, humans develop another desire that they want to do.
Yeah. There's a great analogy for this, which is, this thing that we're talking about, this concept, is essentially what separates humans from other animals. And I'm fairly sure we've discussed this in a previous episode when we were talking about the other book, or at least briefly mentioned it, but this desire for more, this I guess natural urge for always having new desires and fulfilling new things is what separates humans from animals. So animals, if you take for instance like a wolf, so the wolf is going to wake up in the morning, he's going to be hungry, and then he's going to go hunt, and he's going to eat, and then he's going to be thirsty, then he's going to go to the river, drink some water, and then he's going to be tired, so he'll go back to sleep, right? And then he's going to do the same thing next day over and over again, right? And his only other urge will be to procreate, and he's going to be looking for a partner, and once he has one, he will procreate. And so these are the basic needs, the basic urges of any animal. And what sets humans apart from that is our, we wake up in the morning, we're hungry, we go get some breakfast, we eat, then we're thirsty, and then we go and drink some water. But then we are not satisfied. We don't call it a day there. We have things that we want to do. And those things are not essential to our survival, but we still want to do them, and doing them is what makes life fulfilling to us.
Right, and so Mises actually somewhat goes into this. So he says that the lust for more and more things presently inaccessible is the very thing that drives man to economic betterment. To be content is animalistic. Man's most characteristic mark is that he never ceases to endeavor to advance his well-being by purposive activity.
Yeah.
And so that's that's something that I didn't really think about. And it's really interesting that he says to advance his well-being instead of just like material wants, because it kind of disarms any kind of religious argument that, oh, you shouldn't necessarily want
things.
Things, but it doesn't just say things, it says well-being, and no one can really argue against that.
Yeah, and fulfilling our own well-being, the things that we want to do, I guess almost 100% of the time has economic implications. It doesn't matter if they're incredibly shallow and direct, like your biggest desire is owning an iPad, or if it's something indirect like your Switzerland, because in order to travel to Switzerland, I guess standards, you're gonna have to use certain services. So most of our contemporary desires, just not to say all of them, but most of them do have economic implications.
Right.
Right.
Mises actually goes into this a lot more in Human Action. He goes into it very, very in depth too. And I I would argue that without the extortive state and all that, that people would probably prioritize their well-being and save more if they didn't have the state to fall back on now, which has raised time preference and such in society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's about it, about the urge for economic betterment. So it's just an argument, essentially, that betterment is part of human nature. The urge for betterment is a part of human nature. It's not just a made-up concept.
And I think that goes is the best in the world and out of reach of the majority in non-capitalistic countries. And so yeah. Anyways, I need to leave for about 5 minutes, maybe a little bit less. So I will be right back.
Yeah, that's okay. We'll take it. Don't worry. So I think that leads us into the next chapter, right? Is there anything you want to
No,
talk
we could
about?
still.
No, sorry, not the next chapter, just the next section.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Do you got the notes up on your screen?
Yeah. We're gonna talk about status, society, and capitalism now. Unless you have anything else to say about the urge for economic betterment.
I think I would just say that when we get into human action, it's going to go really in depth with like expanding upon that idea. There's a whole section on animal action and what makes human action distinct from it, and it includes the idea that we prioritize we prioritize the what our needs above our wants generally, or our most immediate desire that needs satisfied, saying like water or food. That will be the first thing most people will like try to satisfy before anything else.
Yeah.
And beyond that, that's I don't really have anything else to say with that part.
Alright, so I think we can get into status, society, and capitalism, which is a short section. This is basically a mini introduction to the following sections, in which he's going to go into, I guess, more specific examples of anti-capitalistic mentality and how it manifests in different castes or different groups of society. So this section is basically about how capitalism gets rid of the strict caste system, which was present in just about every regime that preceded it. So, you had obviously the notorious societal hierarchy and feudalism, which was, the monarchs, the clergy, and the knights, and then the serfs, right? And you also have the within later on with Renaissance and absolutism. So you had the nobles and you had the commoners and the bourgeois. But yeah, even before that, society previously has always had almost absolutely strict castes, which people were born into and usually died into, like most of the time. And
right, and it's this very it's the very inability of movement that capitalism squashed.
Yeah. So this was made possible, according to Mises on the book, not only by capitalism but also by equality beyond
equality
the law.
under the law.
Yeah, equality under the law, which has, I guess, grown to be a staple of the Western judicial system. and is actually not present in a lot of other places in the world. So, I mean, we all take it for granted now, but it wasn't always there. It wasn't always a thing. But he argues that this made possible for people to finally, even if they didn't have the same starting point, they still had a chance to move up and to prevent themselves from moving down in terms of their economic and social status.
You're right, and the castes were clearly shown by dress and language, which you see some people still want that. They want to see their betters dressing better and having more posh language and such things like that. Which is kind of interesting. It's kind of like a nostalgia for something that they didn't ever experience.
Yeah. I guess some of it is also part of human nature insofar as belonging to a certain group or adopting a certain identity is in some way fulfilling to a lot of people.
Right. It's also kind of interesting, especially among young people who all believe this, how much they see themselves as being part of the nobility, even though if you go back through their history, their family is basically either merchants at best or nothing at worst,
Yeah. And also how you have people who were nobles and now they're just regular families.
Yep.
I, for instance, have a friend. I don't know him personally, but I know him online, and his family comes from nobility, high, not super high nobility, but still nobility. They used to own land in Europe, Germany, I believe, and they have I guess over 10 generations of going to university and things like that, right? Which, if you stop and think about, is a little bit crazy. Meanwhile, I'm here and I'm the first one in my entire family to go to university. So there are things like that which has, in the old days would have never been possible.
And I think this ties in nicely to the next section called the resentment or frustrated ambition. Now we can try to understand why people loathe capitalism. In a caste system, an individual can ascribe fate to his condition. Under capitalism, your station depends on your own doing. So your wife can berate you for low pay, and you'll be conscious of your own inferiority, and you'll feel humiliated. Meanwhile, under a caste system, if your wife asks you why you're not a duke, you'll say that in order to be married, you'd have to be a duchess, and I would never have married a slave girl instead of a duchess if I was a duke.
Yeah. So what the point that he's making here, the point that he's making here is that while caste systems and they prevent people from rising in society, they also indirectly offer some comfort in why they're unable to rise, because they know that they will be like that for the rest of their lives. So it's not as much of a burden to know that to be in that situation.
Yep. So because of the sway of each according to his accomplishments, a man must be ever reminded of his own failings and others' successes. So man gets to finding a scapegoat. What made him fail was not his own failings, but in the success in society given to scoundrels.
Scoundrels, yeah.
His honesty, not his failings, are the reason for his lack of ascendancy. And I want to is this the chapter that I want to talk about this, or is it the next one? this kind of scapegoating I actually see in a lot of quote unquote left libertarians, especially agorists and free to market types, in that they will basically blame some state intervention in why their black market or whatever business can't succeed, but Walmart does. They will just say, "Oh, Walmart wouldn't even be a thing if there was no state regulation allowing it to happen." However, that doesn't explain Walmart's rise to success. Originally, they came up with a business plan and executed it, and this business plan became the standard for grocers and other warehouse. I don't want to say warehouse, but big retail stores. And so it wasn't just that Walmart, was, the founders of Walmart were born into political life and just could make regulations for their business. No. That came later. It was, in fact, their successful business plan that allowed them to get to the rank where they could influence politics.
Yeah, this is an argument that I make a lot against third positionists as well. So, the fascist types. They all have this great resentment for capitalism. With the fascist types, it's usually a little bit different because it's a slightly more ideological resentment rather than, practical.
Right, but we'll get to the intellectuals soon enough.
Yeah, but the thing is that I want to mention is that this they talk a lot about these all the rich capitalist families, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, and how they rose to prominence within capitalism, especially in the Gilded Age or the late 19th century, which is correct. And they will use that information and then conclude that what we have today is the natural course of capitalism. So in any type of capitalism, in any situation, that would eventually happen. The people who rise to prominence would subvert the system and create something which they can control. And what they just conclude that is a part of capitalism, when in fact, capitalism is an economic model. It's not a political regime or anything. So the political system in which these things came about are completely unrelated to capitalism. And in the case of the United States, we're talking about democracy and presidentialism, right? So a lot of the conclusions that these anti-capitalists draw and associate with capitalism are actually completely unrelated, and even if they are valid criticisms, they are criticisms of democracy and criticism of presidentialism rather than criticism of the free market itself.
Right. Yeah. It's just, to me, when I saw the scapegoating, I was like, this applies really well to some forms of libertarians, because they will basically just try to say you'll get stupid things like businesses, statism, and things like that, and so we need to create a new model of businesses. And
another thing that I just remember, which is also important, I think, is that they also have a lot of resentment, especially towards big businesses. And you gave the example of Walmart, and that's a great example. And one thing that Mises mentions in the book is that big businesses are able to become big businesses, specifically because they attend the demands of the masses. They don't become big businesses by serving the rich. They become big businesses because they're able to fulfill the most basic, widespread desires and demands of society. So, Walmart, as you mentioned, they are a retail store. They sell basically everything you need to go about your daily life, right? So since they have such a variety of products, they are able to attend a lot more people than say a more specific type of businesses, like, I don't know, a clock manufacturer, or just anyone that works with a specific type of product. And by being able to serve a bigger portion of society is exactly how they are able to become the size that they are. You would never see a specific business, like a jewelry store, becomes the size of Walmart.
Right, and the reason why it replaced things like Sears and Target and other, basically what so many quote-unquote libertarians say, and it is true that, the government comes in and messes up with the market, but it's not how a lot of these companies got to be as powerful as they are today, is not by just going to the government. It's how they maintain it, but it's usually not how they got there in the first place.
Yeah, they got there through, legitimate business, almost 10 out of 10 times.
Yep.
Just give me 1 second. I think we are having a minor problem with stream. Let me just check if everything's alright.
Okay, and I'll ask and I'll go to the comments. United Teddy asked what's happening. We're just going over the book, the Anti-Capitalist Mentality. About what would you say? About halfway through this so far, maybe. So yeah, that's what's going on. It's just.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's OBS or if it's just my internet or what. It says that we're having a little bit of. It says we were experiencing issues, but it doesn't really tell me what. But YouTube says that we have an excellent connection. So I'm not sure if it's wrong or if everything's alright. So I just want to ask the people who are watching, if you guys are having problems with the stream, if you guys are having too much buffering, or if the stream is getting interrupted, please let me know. I'll see if I can do anything about it. I'm just not sure if the stream is continuous or not, or if we're losing information. So just please let me know.
Yeah, basically, Teddy. We're just chilling, talking about not really even an economics book, a sociological book by Mises.
Yeah. Also, hello, Scroll. I just noticed you said hi to me. Hello, Scroll.
So the video is lagging. Well, good thing we're not a video-intensive podcast.
Yeah, if it's just a video, I don't really care. Honestly, what's important is the audio, because we're only talking here. The video is just, a background in the chat.
It's just looping.
Yeah. Well, if the audio is working fine, that's all that matters to us. So if you guys have any problems with the audio, if you guys want us to go over anything again, just please let us know, alright?
Yeah, kind of sucks about the video if you're watching, but anyways, let's keep on going. So the fool releases these feelings in slander and defamation, but the sophisticated expresses it through philosophy, the philosophy of anti-capitalism. And I think this is a really good introduction to the next section, the resentment of intellectuals.
Yeah.
Because he basically goes from men find scapegoats, and then he talks about fools, and then, the sophisticated express it through philosophy, and so.
Yeah, do you know what this reminded me? You know that meme where you have the IQ bell curve, and then you have one guy on the low IQ side and he says something, and then you have one guy in the middle where he says something the opposite, and then you have one guy on the high IQ side which says the same thing as the guy on the low IQ side, but more elaborately. And that's basically the point that he's making here. That the people who are unsuccessful because they are either by nature or by whatever reason unprepared for a market economy. They just vent out their frustrations, I guess, irrationally. But the people that are unsuccessful for a reason other than their intellectual capabilities, they will often make use of these intellectual capabilities to vent out their frustration. And that's how we end up with so many anti-capitalistic intellectuals.
Yep. So, it's also kind of interesting that Hoppe refers to himself as an anti-intellectual intellectual.
Yeah. Intellectual club.
Yep. So, the resentment of the intellectual is the common man rarely consorts with people who have succeeded better than him. He never learns from personal experience how different an entrepreneur or executive is. And this is actually something that I don't know. It's something that you probably don't think about in when you're thinking about the anti-capitalist mentality. But this is almost kind of the Dunning-Kruger effect, is that smart people think that they're more average than they really are, and then really dumb people think that they're smarter than they are. And this is mostly because of social group. Really smart people have really smart social, people in their social group, and really dumb people have really dumb people in their social group. Yeah. And so the genius sees, he only talks to the competent people and the people that are basically as smart as him. He's like, oh yeah, everyone is as smart as I am, so I'm just kind of average. And then the dumb person only has dumb people that he talks to. And so he says, oh, I must, be fairly competent because, everyone else is, about my intelligence as well.
Yeah.
So it's something that's really interesting to think about, and it's only when you start broadening your social group that you can really understand how intelligent or unintelligent someone is.
Yeah.
So.
But yeah, he says here that this envy and resentment ends up being, I guess, vented not towards actual people or but rather towards abstractions such as management, capital, or Wall Street. And that's something that we see so much in basically any I guess non-capitalistic ideologies. So you have obviously the most common is these examples that he gave. So you have Marx with everything is wrong because of the bourgeois, or because of the capitalists, or you have also the third positionist side.
Occupy Wall Street people.
Yeah, you also have the third positionist side who are going to blame everything on. Can I say that here on YouTube?
No, you actually can't, but
you guys get the idea, right?
Yeah,
you also have
because of the Talmud.
Yeah. And here's the thing, a lot of the time there is some validity to these claims. They're not like just entirely made up. So there is some validity to them. So there are in fact a bunch of people in the quote-unquote capitalist class who are not the nicest people, and they are overly greedy and sometimes do things that are I guess unfair or immoral. Have people who belong to certain ethno-religious groups who exert more influence over certain things than they should. I hope that's vague enough, but so there is some validity to them, but it's not like these groups of people are a hive mind. It's not like they all act in accordance to each other and like unconsciously. So while they do have some shallow validity to them, most of the time these scapegoats are just blown out of proportion, because they're just useful politically.
All right. So, to kind of sidetrack, Teddy asks if you about inspiration for lyrics for a black metal band with a nationalist/libertarian theme.
Okay. Yeah, I just read the question here. I looked at it before, but I didn't read the whole thing because I didn't want to go. Well, I could give you a long answer about this on this topic, but I'll just go with a short answer so we can go on without taking up too much time of the episode. You can ask me on Twitter if you want more, I guess, more examples or more details, but I'll just go with a short answer. And that is, I think, one of the most important things when writing metal music and metal lyrics, especially, is you have to keep, you have to embrace niche master morality. And that's something that I've done for everything in my life, but it's especially important for metal lyrics. You have to forget the concepts of equality and justice and fairness. If you're going to write brutal music, you have to write brutal lyrics. So if there's any advice that I can give, is that you take concepts that you find interesting and you, I guess, turn them into poetry, because I guess music is poetry, in the most brutal and unapologetic way you can think of. You're not writing a book, you're not writing an essay, you're writing a song. You don't have to give justifications, you don't have to give apologies. You just have to make statements, and you have to make your statements sound either convincing or threatening. That's the advice that I can give right now. That's the short answer.
Okay. So, anyways, yeah, this seems like a conversation for Twitter. I just thought we'd talk about it for a second.
Yeah, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. I have open DMs for anything related to the podcast, or otherwise, just hit me up. But yeah, let's move on.
Yeah, so, anyways, it is entirely different when the conditions of their occupational birth bring people into contact with the winner of prizes that they think they should be the recipients of. They engender hatred of real living beings. One of these groups is the intellectuals. Members of their peer group tower above them in appreciation by the public and income. The intellectual's dislike of capitalism comes from his hatred of his successful colleague. So I don't really see too much to say about this. This is just kind of
yeah,
you know,
it's pretty self-explanatory.
It's basically sour grapes. So the anti-capitalist bias of American intellectuals is the next section, and the hatred in intellectuals is far more pronounced in America than it is in Europe. In Europe, those in the quote-unquote good society come together frequently. New ideas and ideologies get presented to them before they influence bigger circles of people. Access to European society is open to everyone who has distinguished himself. The intellectuals prevail, and others feign interest in intellectual pursuits. Society in this sense is foreign to Americans. There is little social intercourse between successful businessmen and the nation's eminent authors, artists, and scientists. The socialites are not interested in ideas, but but about either playing cards, gossiping about persons, or talking about sports. This is easy to explain. The American intellectuals see the American businessman as a barbarian, interested solely in profit. And this forms the hostility between the American intellectuals and American businessmen. Also, I kind of, as a side note, if you know anything about Protestant history in America, in the 19th century, the rise of anti-intellectualism in Protestantism, American Protestantism especially, was very, very popular. And so what you would have is these American businessmen who were Protestants would often eschew any philosophy or history or economics taught in American universities, because they would see it as like some type of demonic influence, essentially.
Yeah.
All I need is my Bible, essentially, is what they would argue. I don't need no stinking philosopher to help me understand how to think.
Yeah.
So that's another cause of this that Mises didn't really talk about because he wasn't religious himself.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it would have been very unpopular to say this in the 1950s because this anti-intellectualism has basically never gone out of American Protestantism and has essentially led to many bad things for Protestantism. You know, because you're raising kids without a firm foundation of anything, essentially.
Yeah. Another thing that I kind of wanted to mention, I'm not sure exactly if it's on this section now, is that, he talks about that thing which I went over in previous episodes about, which I mentioned, Thomas Sowell, where he talks about his concept of intellectuals and how he defines them as idea workers, or people whose end products are ideas. So at some point in this chapter, I'm not sure if it's this section, Mises talks about how the manufacturer, or the person who produces and sells physical goods, tangible goods, he has an almost certainty, if he is smart, if he's capable of his job, he has some degree of certainty over how much people in society need his products because of the purpose that they serve. So let's say, just a basic example, food. People need to eat, and needing to eat is the reason that people buy food. People are always going to need to eat, so people are always going to be buying food. And the question is only, what type of food and what quantities and what qualities. That's what his job is defining. But when it comes to intellectuals, or people whose end products are ideas, they don't have, because they don't know that people are always going to be buying ideas, or what type of ideas.
Yeah, this is in the section, the communism of Broadway and Hollywood.
Oh, okay, so I'll get back to that later then.
Yeah, so anyways, we'll touch on that later. If a group of people secludes itself from the rest of society, especially also from the intellectuals, in the way American socialites have done, they unavoidably become the target of hostile criticisms on the part of those they keep out of their own circles. And so it's kind of interesting that Mises brings up the fact that basically not talking to the intellectuals makes you hate them, makes them hate you because you're more successful and you won't even hear them out.
Yeah. And the other way around too.
Yeah. So the next section is the resentment of white-collar workers. So white-collar workers are prone to overrate their significance, especially of their work. And so they will see, so the clerk will see a person who walks on his hand who has calloused hands as somehow beneath him, but he makes more money, and this seems ridiculous to him, that he would be seen as inferior to someone who has to work with grease and such. However, what they don't see is that the clerk is basically putting inputs into a machine or just writing down things and just using basic arithmetic for very simple tasks, while the technician is working on machines that are fairly complex and need a certain set of skills. And not only that, it's also somewhat dangerous to work with these machines.
Yeah,
And
I think it's safe to say that there's a little bit of a trope in society that manual labor is always inferior to intellectual labor, and this trope might be a result of intellectuals who are coping and trying to make their work seem more important than other people's work, but it's a trope. It's a thing that exists. People tend to overrate intellectual work and underrate manual work because they associate manual work with like carrying around a bag of cement, and they associate intellectual work with developing scientific theories and etc.
And Mises actually says this really well. It is precisely this complete misconstruction of the real state of affairs that discloses the clerk's lack of insight and power of reasoning.
Yeah.
And also, Mises goes into this and how Marx and Lenin, basically the only type of workers that they knew were these white-collar workers that were clerks, and so they saw the entire control of production and distribution as being essentially, basic collar work, where you just kind of hand out receipts, make receipts, do some basic arithmetic and such. And so they didn't understand how entrepreneurial activities or really how management happened. They just saw that, they just knew people who were clerks and were like, oh, this is easy. We can just, do some receipts and such things, and that's how we can manage the economy.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting insight, and not something I knew about before.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, and Lenin correctly distinguishes between the work of the entrepreneurs on the one hand, and that of the scientifically educated staff of engineers, agronomists, and so on the other hand. So these experts and technologists are mainly the executors of orders. Meanwhile, the entrepreneurs and management are the ones that are making the orders. And so if you really don't understand how management and entrepreneurs are creating these orders, you can just say, oh, well, under socialism, they'll just, these experts and technologists will just obey the armed workers.
Or the party. And they'll just do whatever's best for everyone.
Yep.
Which, then we're going to get into his, the infamous calculation problem.
Right.
Yeah, which
but
I don't think we need to go
interesting.
about here.
Yeah, it's just interesting seeing from their perspective how, it's just how to organize business, essentially.
Yeah. So this was his insight on the grudge against capitalism by the intellectual class. Now we're going to get into the grudge against capitalism by the entrepreneurial class, or at least people associated with the entrepreneurial class, right?
Right. So this is called the resentment of the cousins, and so when you have an estate, a business that the family runs, you're going to want to take the one or two people who can actually run that business. One of two of your children that can run it, and the rest can just get a quota of the profits. This is at least how it worked in. I think this is mostly old Europe, because I don't think of too many American families that work like this.
American families are usually not as big, so they did not have as many cousins.
Not back then. The people who had back in the 1930s, 1920s, the people who had huge fortunes would typically have 8 or 9 children.
I guess that's true, but yeah, it's still a phenomenon more common in Europe.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It was more common in Europe, because the idea. Well, anyways, I'm just not used to this in America, so
yeah,
let's get on to the.
This kind of ties in back with the differences that he noted between the socialites in America and in Europe. So I guess the families, the European families, the cousins would be more engaged with one another.
Right. So let's just go into an explanation of this instead of keep on getting sidetracked.
Yeah.
So when you have this big business, you'll want to allow the people to run the business who actually understand it. So out of all your children, only 1 or 2 will really be able to run the business, and the rest, they'll still be supported by the business as it grows and grows and grows, but they shouldn't be managers of the business. And what ends up happening is that these quote-unquote cousins that don't run the business but profit off of it will constantly see the managers of the business as somehow cheating them out of their birthright, as they take on a larger salary than they give to the non-managerial cousins.
Yeah, because they don't understand the nature of the work.
Right. They also don't understand how much work it is to run a business. They kind of see it as
easy. Something that's just waiting and watching the money flow in.
Right. And so this is popped up by the fact that the universities and the boarding schools that they go to kind of say this as well. It's kind of interesting that Mises even talks about the education also, giving them these ideas essentially.
Yeah.
And so these cousins will be, busy themselves with painting, writing, or other arts. And because of the lack of the socialites valuing these things, they won't really be able to talk to these people like their kin that are businessmen. And it's kind of interesting that most of the eminent authors, scholars, and statesmen, all gentlemen of no occupation. They are basically subsidized by their family, and because they're not needed to run the business because they'd fail at it. They just kind of just given a stipend and being like, okay, do whatever you want with this.
Yeah, one important note that he makes is that this subsidization of the cousins is not necessarily a bad thing. He does mention that several important artists and philosophers and a lot of important people arose from being cousins, from being subsidized by their families and corporate entrepreneur friends. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does create this condition which makes certain people prone to go on to adopt negative opinions of capitalism, negative viewpoint of capitalism.
And so this cheating of them of their birthright leads them to quarrel with their managerial cousins continually. It is not astonishing that the bosses lose their temper. They are proud of their success in overcoming all the obstacles which governments and labor unions place in the way of big business. They are fully aware of the fact that, but for their efficiency and zeal, the firm would have either long since gone astray, or the family would have been forced to sell out. And so, it's the bosses and the cousins feud. And it's kind of interesting that Mises ends this chapter talking about how these cousins take their subsidy and give it to support strikes, even strikes in the factories from which their own revenues originate, and give it to progressive magazines and progressive newspapers. They also give it to universities and colleges and institutes for social research, and sponsor all sorts of Communist Party activities.
Yeah, and remember, it's a little bit of a tangent, but it's very relevant. Remember in the beginning of the episode when I mentioned that there were certain things about this book that aged incredibly well?
Yep.
This is one of them. So nowadays, more recently with, I guess, the families decreasing in size, this happens more in father and son relationships rather than brother and cousin, but it's still the same concept. And what has happened is a lot of these people who inherit large empires, or who are in line to inherit large empires, have absolutely no idea of what it takes to run set businesses. So they grow into, they're just raised with all this money, and they grow into massive consumerists, but also grow a lot of disdain for the source of their money, which they don't understand the work that goes behind it. And with the intellectual and, I guess, social disdain for capitalism manifesting, they also feel, I guess, some sort of personal regret or embarrassment about their position in society, because they were born into a rich family. And they grow this tendency to support these leftist causes as an attempt to make up for, I guess, their capitalist ancestors. So this is one of the points that he makes that has become more and more obvious throughout the years.
Right, and it's kind of interesting that he calls them Paulo socialists or penthouse Bolsheviks, and I've basically come to calling them champagne socialists.
Yeah, here we have here in Brazil we have a very common term, which is caviar communists.
But it's...
Or iPhone communists is also very common.
Yeah, it's just you see this a lot in universities. If you've ever stepped foot on one, is that you'll see these people driving a BMW or a Mercedes Benz. They've never walked in their life, but they have these things because their parents just give it to them, and they're like, "Oh yeah, Bernie Sanders is obviously what we should, all vote for." And it's just like, do you not understand that you would not have these things if Sanders was,
And while I'm not of the opinion that, if you want to be a communist, you need to stop using computers and stop using cell phones. You need to move into the fucking jungle and just live in community. I'm not of that opinion. We're all born into a certain society. There's nothing wrong with living in accordance to it. But the problem is, while they preach these ideologies and preach anti-capitalism, they don't want to give up the best of the best that they are used to.
Yep. So
it's not like these people are expected to give up, I guess, contemporary lifestyle. It's just that they're, embodying it while criticizing it.
School Lockheed says, is the author trying to argue that the entrepreneur and businessmen are better sources of counsel? That would be... I'm not entirely sure what you're talking about. He did say that getting rid of the intellectuals from the socialites and just basically gossiping, looking at sports, and playing cards, has led to resentment from the intellectuals. So I think he's more talking about cohesiveness in society than it is the fact that businessmen are just like these paragons of wisdom.
Yeah, it's not that they're better counselors, it's that they're knowledgeable in their position.
Right, and so
And
when
people
you
who don't have that knowledge, they don't understand how valuable it is, I suppose.
Right, so the people who don't understand entrepreneurship, management, and all that, they don't understand. They're lacking in knowledge to understand society fully, and therefore they have all these anti-capitalist philosophies that obviously have to go astride because they're missing crucial information.
Yeah, and not everyone
Right.
has to be a businessman to understand this. I'm not a businessman. There are just certain things we're never going to know everything. So there are things that it's important for us to understand the logic behind them. And even if we're never going to live through it, we're going to have to accept it because, you're never going to be everything in life. So you're never going to be an entrepreneur and an artist and an intellectual and etc. etc. But understanding what these classes, what these groups of people do, and why their contributions to society are important and how is important to understanding society as a whole. And a lot of these people who are intellectuals, they just end up placing themselves in a high horse and ignoring the contributions of other classes.
Right,
Right.
and it's not even just that they ignore it. It's also it's mostly they don't even know that such things happen. As Marx said, capital automatically begets profits. I mean, they just kind of they just have this huge blind spot that because they don't talk to businessmen and entrepreneurs. But go ahead, Emo.
I was gonna say, that way of thinking ignores the division of labor and how entrepreneurship serves as one of the most important functions in determining the needs of the consumer. Is that they take accumulated capital and employ it to address what they think are the most I guess the needs and demand at the moment that need satisfying.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think we've kind of said everything we need to say about the cousins. So let's go to the last section of this chapter, the communism of Broadway in Hollywood.
Actually, just before we move on, just one short comment. We talked about how this manifests, more obviously than ever nowadays, about the cousins and about how they resent capitalism. This also has a lot to do with how corporations have become so accepting of progressivism, in my opinion. But because since they have increasingly progressive members within their ranks, not just as employees but also as family members and people financing them, they have also become naturally more accepting of these things, not for economic purposes, for economic reasons, as a lot of people argue. They just end up doing these things for ideological reasons, and even if it means they're going to lose money, which is why companies continue to go woke, even though sometimes it makes them lose money.
Right, and it's not just that companies do this just because they have family members, but because of anti-discrimination laws, they have to have human resource commissars.
Yeah.
And these human resource commissars are basically commissars of wokeism. And so you have to be, they basically, by law, have to have this department that just is like a social justice department, essentially. And it's just like, well, what do you think is going to happen to businesses once you make it a requirement for them to be woke? So, okay.
Yeah.
So
Now we
the
can move
communism,
on.
the communism of Broadway and Hollywood. The
So-
many to whom capitalism gave a comfortable income and leisure are yearning for entertainment. Crowds throng to the theaters. The actors of which are not prisoners of starvation. They make good money, and so it's kind of interesting that Hollywood and Broadway are hotbeds of communism.
Yeah, you have in, I guess, classical Marxism, which places a heavy emphasis on class struggle, which, as we mentioned in the beginning of this episode, isn't a thing anymore because most people live comfortably nowadays. So that class struggle and that whole thing, exploitation thing, just doesn't happen anymore, or at least not nearly as prominently. And especially amongst these groups of artists. So what the thing is, since they live so comfortably and since they have little to complain about, why would they oppose the system, the economic model of capitalism so vehemently? And
right, and at the end of this section, he says it can be fairly assumed that none of the Hollywood and Broadway communists have ever studied the writings of any socialist author, and still less any serious analysis of the market economy.
yeah, that's a thing. That's a most common thing nowadays, and to some extent, I guess it's not really a problem. Insofar as not everyone is obligated to be engaged in politics. But nowadays, I think it's more common than ever to just see people supporting things they actually have no idea what they are.
Right. I think a lot of it has to do with, the amount of egalitarianism promoted, and that, actors and such, we've all seen like how many of these people have been like stars and stuff, and now they're on crack and, on drugs, and their life is ruined and all this stuff after their heyday and stardom is done. They see something that will like secure them, some form of, future and
right. And if we want to understand why the Hollywood and Broadway communists are socialists, we should really get into the meat of this section instead of jumping to the conclusion. So, under capitalism, material success depends on the appreciation of a man's achievements on the part of the sovereign consumers. In this regard, there is no difference between the services rendered by a manufacturer and those rendered by a producer, an actor, or a playwright. Yet the awareness of this dependence makes those in the show business much more uneasy than those supplying the customers with tangible amenities. The manufacturers of tangible goods know that their products are purchased because of certain physical properties. They may reasonably expect that the public will continue to ask for these commodities cheaper as offered to them, for it is unlikely that the needs which these goods satisfy will change in the near future. However, with entertainment, people long for amusement because the essence of the entertainment industry is variety. Patrons applaud most what is new and therefore unexpected and surprising. They are capricious and unaccountable. They disdain what they cherished yesterday. A tycoon of the stage or the screen must always fear the waywardness of the public. He awakes rich and famous one morning and may be forgotten the next day. He knows very well that he depends entirely on the whims and fancies of a crowd hankering after merriment. So he is always agitated by anxiety. So it is obvious that there is no relief from what makes these stage people uneasy. Thus they catch at a straw. Communism, some of them think, will bring their deliverance. Is it not a system that makes all people happy? Do not very eminent men declare that all the evils of mankind are caused by capitalism, and will will be wiped out by communism. And so this is kind of the reasoning behind the Broadway and Hollywood communists, essentially.
Yeah. This is a little bit unrelated. I'm not gonna go on about this. I just wanna mention it. Have you guys watched Once Upon a Time in Hollywood? The film?
No.
No?
No.
So, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a film that was released last year. It's directed by Quentin Tarantino, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. And it stars Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt. So, it's a great film. But I'm not going to go on about it, I just wanted to mention. The movie is about DiCaprio's character, which is an actor in the end of the Hollywood Golden Age, which is the end of the 60s, right? And I believe 1969 the movie set in. And the movie is not about this, but it does show this. It's that the character that he's playing, which is an actor, was prominent because of a TV show, a Westerner, and now as the golden age of Hollywood reaches the end, he's not that relevant anymore. So he's kind of grasping for a role, for a big comeback that's going to make him a staple of cinema. And the movie is not exactly about this story, and he doesn't become a communist, but it shows this struggle that they have, that once they tasted fame, they want to maintain it, and once they have trouble maintaining it, they easily fall for I guess cheap things. And in the movie he ends up falling for alcoholism, but communism is probably worse. And it just happened to occur to me to think of the movie while I was reading it, because it shows this really well, even though the movie is not about this. It just shows that even people at the highest ranks of society, if they're not sure that they're going to be able to maintain their position, they will become more, I guess, susceptible to these types of ideologies and these types of lifestyles.
Right, everyone wants to be secure in their position, and so, especially if you have this existential uncertainty about your position, they,
Yeah.
you're going to be anything that comes along and says it's going to solve your issue, you're going to really want to
embrace it. And this is the same brief point that I wanted to make earlier about intellectuals. They're also vulnerable to this, because since their end product is ideas, it's not something that's tangible. They are also more uncertain about their economic stability. So this also applies to them to some extent.
Okay. So, Emo, you made the notes for chapter 2. Let's go into it.
All right. So, chapter 2, part 1, capitalism as it is seen by the common man. Within a few generations, capitalism transformed human affairs more radically than anything in the last 10,000 years had. The citizens of every capitalistic country benefit from every minute of the capitalistic way of thinking and acting. This was accomplished with just a few authors and a handful more of statesmen who assimilated their writings into their governance. But the masses and even the businessmen who effectively utilized the capitalistic method couldn't comprehend their importance of their operation. Western civilization adopted capitalism upon the recommendation on the part of a small elite.
And now it's abandoning on the part of a small elite as well. Which is kind of funny. But yeah, the point that... So now we're going to leave. I guess he's going to stop talking about the elites of society, the I guess in terms of social status. So he's gonna stop talking about the intellectuals and the artists, and he's gonna talk about the common man. What does the actual
Right. So
worker think of capitalism?
So chapter 2 is called The Ordinary Man's Social Philosophy, and so Kyle is entirely right that we're leaving, the cousins, the intellectuals, and the actors, and we're going to more to the common man and what he says. As the problem says, retard club.
Yeah. Yeah, retard club.
Yep. This is the Sub-Saharan IQ club.
I think he was talking about us, but okay, that works too.
Yeah,
Not untrue.
I thought I'd just roll with it,
Yeah. Yeah, I was making this point earlier. Man, if your movement does not have a certain amount of retards in it, your movement is normie and cringe, okay?
Wait, what?
I was making this point earlier with another friend, like in a conversation. If your political movement does not have a certain amount of schizos and retards, your movement is normie and cringe. Period.
Don't normally movements usually have retards and schizos?
Not as many as ours, and that's a good thing.
Somebody's gotta have retarded foot soldiers.
Anyways.
No, I was just that wasn't a serious comment. Just ignore it. I just wanted to wait for Emo to get back.
Yes, sorry, I got disconnected.
Number 2?
Alright. For a short period of time, economics books were the most popular books being bought. But the trend didn't last because economics is unpalatable to the common man. Economics is so different to technological and natural sciences and to history and jurisprudence that it seems strange and repulsive to the beginner. Its heuristic singularity is viewed with skepticism from those who work in labs or libraries. Its epistemological singularity appears nonsensical to narrow-minded positivists. People would rather pick up a book that fits with their preconceived notions of that economics ought to be in accordance to the logical structures of biology or physics, and are deterred by the mental exertion that the analysis of problems require.
Yeah, so what he's saying is that economics is too complicated for most people, and that's correct, because economics is not basic arithmetics like some people act like it is. But it's also not just complete sociology.
Right, and it's not so much that it's even too difficult. It's that it's too different. It's not purely empirical like technological and natural sciences, and it's not like history and jurisprudence. So
yeah,
it just it requires a very, very different way of thinking, and many people don't want a different way of thinking. They don't want to, have different ways of thinking. It's like, okay, if I'm thinking about physics, I need to be kind of an empiricist, and then if I'm talking about history and jurisprudence, I need to, really look into tradition and such. And then when I do economics, I need to be this like logical a priori thinker. They don't want to do that. They just want to have their like little part of it, essentially.
Yeah.
And so this is a big reason why so many people I know that are engineers just don't comprehend anything but engineering, really.
Yeah, I mean, people have a field that they have a field of specialty, right? And this is a point that we've already made previously, I'm sure, which is, oftentimes people think that because they are specialists in something, they will assume that they are specialists in other things as well. And that's just not true. And with economics being such a different subject, it often leads to very, very bad conclusions drawn by people who are not specialists in the subject.
Yep. And so I don't have anything else to say.
Yeah, let's go on to point number 3.
Alright. A major reasoning behind this is people don't attribute the rapid economic and technological advancement to classical liberalism and laissez-faire economics, but to a naturally occurring progression that would have occurred in any governmental system anyway. The Marxists have adopted this thinking with approval and is part of their appeal. They clothed it with a pseudo-philosophical veil that made it gratifying to both Hegelian spiritualism and crude materialism. In the scheme of Marx, the material productive forces are a superhuman entity independent of the will and the actions of men. They will go their own way that is prescribed by the inscrutable and inevitable laws of a higher power. Higher power. They change mysteriously and force mankind to adjust its social organization to these changes for the material productive forces. Oh, sorry. Let me go back. Um, they will go their own way that is prescribed by the inscrutable and inevitable laws of a higher power. They change mysteriously and force mankind to adjust its social organization. To these changes from material productive forces shun one thing, to be enchained by mankind's social organization.
Yeah, so to me, what this is talking about is basically how most people don't understand progress. And, it's a pretty simple point. When we are born, we basically take everything that exists in our reality for granted. So, we all grew up with certain things that the previous generation did not grow up with, and we take those things for granted. Um, and then we learn, right? When we learn that previous generations did not have these things, uh, we already take these things for granted. So when we learn about the past and about human progress and how that progress is almost exponential, we just learn about it and we don't learn about the circumstances in which progress came about.
Right, and this also goes into basically the next point, which is about the march of history, and it's just kind of those inevitable laws that lead us to better life, essentially.
Yeah.
Explain the Hegelian spiritualism bit, because we've discussed like Hegel for like a moment, but I don't know what he means by Hegelian spiritualism.
Hegelianism had Hegel had a complicated form of spiritualism. It's not something I really understand. I haven't really looked into it. I just know that he's not the pure materialist that Marx was.
Okay. Well, all right. I guess moving on. Um, Point 4. Marx teaches the material productive forces were embodied in the shape of the handmill, and then they arranged human affairs according to the pattern of feudalism. When the unfathomable laws that determined the evolution of the material productive forces substituted the steam mill for the hand mill, feudalism had to give way to capitalism. Since then, the material productive forces have developed further, and their present shape and present shape requires the substitution of socialism for capitalism. Those who try to check the socialist revolution are committed to a hopeless task. It is impossible to stem the tide of historical progress. So, I think what he's saying there is that because of the changes in like the hand mill going towards a steam mill, it was probably going to happen anyway, and this advancement was, seen as a step forward, but I don't. But Marxists apparently believe that capitalism was just a step forward towards going to socialism, at least in the beginning stages. But it has gotten out of control, in their opinion.
Yeah.
So now in order to correct the excesses of the alleged excesses of capitalism, we need socialism to redistribute, capital.
Yeah. And this, I guess, this thing about you know, everlasting march towards progress and towards prosperity. Um, I guess basically every dissident ideology has as its most basic prerequisite rejecting it, because if we're always marching towards progress, why should we dissent, right? Why would we dissent? And I think that sometimes it's unfounded, sometimes it's founded, but I think that the concept itself, that the march towards progress and prosperity is eternal, is kind of silly, because even if we have been progressing a lot throughout the years, throughout the ages, all of that progress is still dependent on human action, and if human action is hindered or altered in some way, so is that progress.
Right.
That's something that the Marxists seem to reject, because they seem to think, not seem to think, they think that this freedom of human action and freedom of, private endeavors is exactly what's hindering the progress.
Which is ironic, given how much they take advantage of it.
Yeah.
And all that. Yes, Colton?
Yeah, it's also kind of interesting. One of my most liked tweets is actually telling someone that progress politically means progression towards communism. And so the communists don't just think that there's this unfathomable law that will bring about more material productivity, but this unfathomable law also will bring about communism.
Yeah.
So,
and they seem to think that they are the bringers of this inevitable system, and that they're justified in it because this march toward progress is apparently some divine mission to them.
yep.
Yeah.
So
At first, it's very interesting because it's a very, I guess, if you understand things the way we do, it's almost like a deranged mindset, and they just think that society is going to organize itself as long as these restraints are removed.
Which that doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, it makes absolutely no sense.
Another thing, they seem to only think like capitalists or landlords are the ones that are, ripping you off, but they never bring up like taxes or, whole quarters or halves of people's checks just going to the government. If imagine if you just had all your money in your check, and how much you would be able to, address your needs and save, for the future, had you had, the money that you earned.
Yeah.
But they don't. They just think that, oh well, I'm doing all this work for this dude, and I'm only getting paid this much. Why am I only getting paid this much? Well, you seem to forget that you signed a contract essentially with your employer, like basically saying like, okay, I would do this work for this amount of money, but that then you just turn around and reject it as if that's somehow morally indefensible.
Yeah, and they think that because the nature of property is illegitimate, anyone who owns property is by default exploiting someone.
Right.
Shall we continue?
Yep.
Anyway, leftists differ in many ways, but they all agree on one thing, and that is looking at progressing material improvement as a self-acting process. Union members take their standard of living for granted, and so much more than even the most prosperous people of earlier generations and non-Americans. It uh, it doesn't occur to him that big business may have played a role in what he called the American way of life. In his eyes, management represents the unfair claims of exploiters who are intent of depriving him of his birthright. He believes in the course of historical evolution as irrepressible increase towards a continuous increase in the productivity of his labor. To him, it is obvious that the fruits of his betterment by rights belong exclusively to him. It is merit that the quotient of the value of products turned out by the processing industries divided by the number of hands employed tended towards an increase. The truth is that the increase in what is called productivity of labor is due to the employment of better tools and machines. 100 workers in a modern factory produce per unit of time a multiple of what 100 workers used to produce in workshops of pre-capitalistic craftsmen. The improvement is not a condition by higher skill, competence, or application on part of the individual worker, but it is due to the employment of more efficient tools and machines, which in turn is the effect of the accumulation and investment of more capital. The terms of capitalism, the terms capitalism, capital, and capitalist were employed as slurs by Marx, and today are used by most people as such as well, including the U.S. government with negative connotation. Yet these words point towards the main factor whose operation produced all the marvelous achievement, who produced the marvelous achievement of the last 200 years, that being the unprecedented improvement of the average standard of living for a continuously growing population. What distinguishes modern conditions from those of pre-capitalist and underdeveloped nations is the supply of capital. No technological improvement could be possible without the capital acquired has not previously been accumulated by saving.
Yeah, I have two important points that I want to make here. They're different, but they're both about this thing. The first one is that he mentions how there's a lot more production now than there used to be several years ago, or a century ago, 2 centuries ago, and that's because of labor-saving devices. And
Right.
the thing about capitalism, which is most different from what it used to be before the Industrial Revolution, is that I guess the order in which goods are created and or designed and then distributed to society has basically inverted. So back in the day, in the era of craftsmanship, where basically all labor was manual, and you had one person or a small group of people designing and crafting a specific product. All of those products, they would be designed and crafted for the higher classes. since people were unable to change their castes in society, they would naturally, these people would naturally make products for the rich, and since these products were designed to be much more intricate and much more delicate, because it was a lot more work to begin with. So they were first marketed towards the higher classes, and then with time, as these shops expanded, it wasn't a factory still, it was just a shop, but they would begin to expand. These products would go on to be simplified and then distributed or sold at lower prices for, more common people. And nowadays, in our industrial reality, it's pretty much the opposite. So when a company comes up with a new product, they have the masses in mind. They are usually marketing towards the lower middle classes or even the lower classes. So they're going to make their product as affordable as possible. And then afterwards, after that type of product has been popularized, then other companies or even the same companies are going to come in and create more sophisticated and more high-end products in that same category, and then appeal to the higher classes. Because nowadays much more money is made by selling to the masses than by selling to the rich elites, and that's why capitalism ultimately serves the population, the majority, more than previous economic models did.
That can be true in certain cases, but when you're talking about, let's say, consumer electronics, it's basically the opposite. There's these really technologically advanced boondoggles, essentially, like plasma TVs back in the aughts, that are originally very, very expensive, but the early adopters basically pay for R&D to make it more cheap. And as competition in plasma TVs goes on, they get cheaper and cheaper until, they'll actually replaced by an even more advanced OLED TV.
Yeah, when you have such we're talking about non-essential things, I guess, like TVs and other things like that. Yes, that's still true. Usually the first products are very expensive and they are limited to the higher, to the richer people, the richer classes. But another thing that we see with capitalism is that the time that it takes for these products to become cheaper and cheaper until they're accessible to everyone is ever decreasing with capitalism. So you have things that, and I'm pretty sure he mentions this in the book as well. When TVs first came out, in the US, it took basically no time for TVs to become a product that everyone had. Meanwhile, in less capitalistic economies such as Brazil, which is where I live, and I can say this from first-hand anecdotes, since my parents grew up in this reality. When they were being raised, TVs were already commonplace in the United States, but here in Brazil they were very limited to rich people, or maybe not even rich, but still high medium classes and etc. And it took a longer time for them to become as popular as they were in the United States, most likely specifically because we have a less free economy.
My internet connection dipped out for most of that, so I can't really say anything.
Long story short, I said that the freer the economy is, the less time it's going to take for these products to become popularized and accessible to the masses.
Right. And you said something about unnecessary products, and that's how unnecessary products would happen. Well, if it's necessary, like food, what would end up happening is that basically substitutes happen. So, for instance, back in the 19th century, potatoes were what fed the poor, but as industrial agriculture came into being, so let me back up. In the 19th century, potatoes fed the poor, and wheat was the cash crop that you'd sell to the rich. However, as agricultural processes went into being, the Industrial Revolution and all of that, wheat actually became more, cheaper, and people are able to live off of it, even though it has less calories per hectare than potatoes.
Yeah.
And so, I don't think this is just a thing of the unnecessary goods. It's just that it takes more productive capital to make something cheaper than otherwise it otherwise is. So, for instance, Tom Woods in Last Week, he said that in 1807, you might have been able to take every single productive resource available in the world, everyone's time, to make a single iPad, or just to make iPads in general.
Mm-hmm.
And while this is true, it would, you wouldn't have food, you wouldn't have the fixing of houses, you wouldn't be building more houses, and so on and so forth. And so it wouldn't be desirable to do that. But this just shows how expensive iPads were in the past. But as we got more and more productive capital, capital accumulation, iPads became accessible to more and more people.
Yeah.
And so this is just kind of how it almost necessarily has to be, is that the rich get something first, and then I don't want to say trickle down, but eventually it becomes cheaper and cheaper until, the poor can have it as well.
Yeah, the example that I'd given was televisions. So I said that, and I think he mentions this in the book, televisions, it took a really short time where televisions were created to the time where they became popularized. It took a relatively short time in America, because America has such a free economy. And meanwhile, in Brazil, and I know this because of my parents and my grandparents have told me, it took a lot longer time for it. So by the time TVs were already popular in America and were accessible to a fair amount of the population, they were still considered high-end products here, and specifically because we have a less free economy. Right?
Hello?
Did you catch that?
Yeah, I caught that. Sorry, I was looking on what I couldn't see any chat updates, so I was doing something on my end.
Okay, no, I just wanted to make sure it didn't cut out.
Yep. So
I was gonna say real quick. I remember when I was in elementary school, and I was in the gifted program, and we got to go to this I guess technology fair or something, where a whole bunch of new and innovative things were being worked on and showcased. And I remember back then, they had this was 15 years ago, and they had high-end plasma TVs, touch screens, all types of stuff that right now it was incredibly expensive when we went to the fair and saw all the things that they had been working on. Now 4K TVs are already dropping dramatically in prices to under often $1,000 or such, when it wasn't more than a few years ago that these things were so much more expensive, and now they're dropping exponentially quickly.
And plasma TVs aren't even a thing anymore, because they've been replaced by OLEDs.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had a bunch of crazy stuff back then. When we went to the thing, and now to see it's affordable now. Like beyond plasma screen, just everything that's even better
Yeah, I
and
have a plasma
cheaper
screen.
and all that.
Yeah.
So
So I think Kyle said he has a plasma TV.
Yeah, I have a plasma TV. It's before this, it's a 42-inch plasma TV. Before this one, back in my old house, we had a tube TV. So that one one of those that's like very big and thick, right? So when we finally got a
back
plasma TV, yeah, when we finally got a plasma TV, it's impressive how thin it is, and it's still like what 4 inches thick or something, probably. And no, probably not that much, but it's still pretty thick. If you compare it to what are like flat screens nowadays, which are like what 1 inch thick. I don't know. It's just impressive how the amount of competition that we have nowadays makes this process of technological progress and things becoming popularized and becoming cheaper, how it becomes much faster with all the amount of competition that we have.
Yeah, and it's not just that it's becoming cheaper; they're also just becoming better. Like if you look at, I believe it was plasma TVs. If you look at it from an oblique angle, it looks like it's off.
Yeah.
But you have to look at it basically head on in order to not get that blackening effect, essentially, of the image.
Yeah, that happens with old phones and monitors a lot.
Yeah, so it's
No, not
but now,
phones, but old monitors.
yeah. So, anyways, let's continue.
Yeah, so I think
Alright.
we are on point 9 now, if I'm not mistaken.
No, 8.
0.8. Apparently, I numbered these wrong. I went back and fixed them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Saving or capital accumulation is the agency which has resulted in the step-by-step transformation of the search for food to that of industry. Every step forward on the way toward prosperity is the result of saving. Entrepreneurs employ the capital goods made available by savers for the most economical satisfaction among the not yet satisfied wants of the consumers. With I can't say that word. Technologists. Thank you. They play a large part together in economic progress. The rest of mankind benefits from these three types of people despite doing nothing to help. Capital accumulation exceeding the increase in population raises on one hand the marginal productivity of labor and on the other hand cheapens the products. The market process provides the common man with the opportunity to enjoy the fruits of other people's achievements. It forces the three progressive classes to serve the non-progressive majority in the best possible way. And when he's referring to the progressive classes, he's talking about savers, entrepreneurs, and what was the other one?
Savers, entrepreneurs, and I guess the people who invent.
Technologists, yeah.
The
It's
technologists.
not necessarily people who
Yeah.
invent, but like technologist would be any engineer to make something slightly better. So this would be like someone who makes the Galaxy S9 from the S8, and then therefore makes the S10 from the S9. It's just small incremental improvements as well.
Yeah.
It's
So
not
yeah,
just like
basically, I think it's important just for the sake of it. He's not talking about social progressivism here. He's talking about, actual economic and technological progress. So he's not talking about culture here. Just because he uses this term progressive, I just feel like it's important to clear this out so no one gets confused. But yeah, he's basically the dividing society between the people who are responsible for progress, which are the people who save money, the people who invest money, and the people who turn invested money into actual new things. And he's saying that the rest of us are able to enjoy these things, these accomplishments of this class, but also that
So
we are all free to join this class and profit from its,
right. So small correction. It's not the people who save and invest are one class. The class forgotten is the entrepreneurs who employ these invested capital in order to basically employ the technologists to make the new widget.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot about that. I just ate it up in my thought process. So
Right,
yeah, it's
right.
basically the people who save money and invest, which are the savers. The people who employ money into hiring people and deciding what needs to be done, which are the entrepreneurs. And then the people who turn these things into reality, and they design things and they create and improve, which are the technologists.
Yep.
And we
Being
all, even people who are not a part of this class, they are still able to enjoy the fruits of their labor as consumers. But they are also free to join them if they wish to. So anyone's able to become a saver. You just need to work and save your money. You're also free to start your own business, free to become an entrepreneur, and you're also free to learn how to design things and become a technologist and work for an entrepreneur.
Yep. Yeah. Let's go on to 12.
Yep.
Yeah, that was pretty much what 11 was saying anyway. To the common man, all those new industries that are supplying him with the amenities unknown to his father came into being by some mystical agency called progress. Capital accumulation, entrepreneurship, and technical ingenuity did not contribute anything to the spontaneous generation of prosperity. If any man has to be credited, let me go back. This is from the perspective of just a common man who doesn't know anything about economics or anything. So
Yeah.
this is explaining through the common man's eyes what he sees is going on. So, capital accumulation, entrepreneurship, and technological ingenuity did not contribute anything to the spontaneous generation of prosperity. If any man has to be credited with what John Doe considers as the rise in the productivity of labor, then it is the man on the assembly line. Unfortunately, uh, unfortunately, uh, in this sinful world, there is exploitation of man by man. Business skims the cream and leaves, as the Communist Manifesto points out, the creator of all good things to the manual worker, not more than he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race. Consequently, the modern worker, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks
Hold up.
deeper and deeper. What's up?
The creator of all good things to the manual worker, not more than he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race. You just cut out at that last part.
Yeah.
Oh, I did.
Yep. So consequently, just go on.
Okay, can you hear me fine now?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Consequently, the modern worker, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. So, basically, what he's saying is that the common man sees his basically fellow worker as the one doing all the labor, but doesn't see how the businessman and the entrepreneur and
The technologist.
the technologist all working together to address the needs of the consumer, who give them the money to fulfill their wants and needs. He just sees that the worker doing the labor, the physical labor, and only getting paid so much. He doesn't see that while he is important to the process, he is also replaceable and should probably be grateful for the standard of living that all these other people have achieved, because it will continuously get better. Yeah. And he basically says, according to Marx, that what you get is only enough to barely get by and have children.
Right. So I don't have anything to say about this. I do like that he says for the propagation of his race.
Yeah.
It's fairly interesting how these Oro people talked fairly openly about things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure this this would have been taken
Right, and so race, he's not talking about like whites or Mexicans or blacks. He's talking about like
yeah.
his race, the Roncos.
Yeah.
It's just another way of saying class, essentially.
Yeah.
It's a subset of people, but anyways.
But I think this also does apply to other demographics, but that's besides the point. So just moving on.
Yep, going to 13.
The worst exploitation, says professors, labor leaders, and politicians, is affected by big business. They feel they fail to realize that the characteristic mark of big business is mass production for the satisfaction of the needs of the masses. Under capitalism, the workers themselves, directly or indirectly, are the main consumers of all those things that the factories are turning out. The authors of this description of capitalistic industry are praised at universities as the greatest philosophers and benefactors of mankind, and their teachings are accepted with reverential awe by millions whose homes, besides other gadgets, are equipped with radios or television sets. Excuse me. In the early days of capitalism, there was still a considerable time lag between the emergence of innovation and it becoming available to the masses. Gabriel Tarde? Does anybody know how to say his last name?
I
You
think
said
it started.
Tarde pointed out that innovation is the fancy of the minority before it becomes the need of the masses. This was also true of the automobile, but big-scale production by big business has shortened and almost eliminated the time lag.
Yeah, this is what we talked about earlier with how, technology is just takes really very little time to become commonplace nowadays. Used to be different. Now it's a very short process.
Right.
It's what we talked about earlier with the plasma TVs and iPads, etc.
Yep.
I do think that a very important, not necessarily related to the point of this section, but one thing that I also related to what I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, when I said that some things in this book aged incredibly well, and some things he probably would have written differently if he were to write it with hindsight. And this is one of the things that I would like to mention. So just to reiterate it, this book was published in 1956, and Mises died in 1973. So, he's old, and the book is old. And one of the things that I think it's important to mention, us who are used to Austrian economics, we kind of understand this already, but other people might not. And it's that if he were to see the state of big businesses today, the situation in which they are and how they behave, he would have probably not mentioned them so positively. And nothing that he says here is wrong, but it kind of, if you were to just read this and not read anything else related to Austrian economics or related to libertarianism, it's easy to understand that how people would take away that there's just a worship of big business by libertarians, and
Well,
nowadays that's problematic because even we acknowledge the several problems that big businesses are causing. They are just not related to this point, but still, you're by mentioning all these companies or these types of businesses positively, it does help create this idea that all libertarians just worship big businesses. But I think that if he had seen the current situation of big businesses today, if we were to make this point today, we would probably add a caveat.
I think
so he does actually add a
Rothbard.
caveat in the first chapter where he's always talking. He says a couple times that this is only true in absentia of government intervention, essentially.
Yeah, that's true. But it's just nowadays you have to be very, very careful about mentioning, I guess, big businesses in positively, and for a good reason. The thing is that when we defend market economies, the most common criticism from both leftists and third positionists is that they are going to use currently existing businesses as an argument against economic freedom because of the subversive nature of a lot of contemporary big businesses. So it's important to bear in mind that to distinguish, I suppose, what he means by big businesses here, which he's just talking about any big company that provides for a lot of people, to the proto-political organizations that contemporary big businesses are.
All right.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say that this was a big split between Ayn Rand and Rothbard. I forget who started the argument, but I believe it was Rothbard responded to Ayn Rand saying that I think she wrote either a book or an essay or maybe a chapter in something. I can't remember which, but it's basically saying that big business and corporations are the most persecuted, persecuted groups. And Rothbard countered, her argument saying that it's not it's not without reason that a lot of businesses do get subsidization and stuff, you know, by the state and will either, carry out what the state wants or,
Yeah,
other
just
things
just
that are not
don't.
natural market phenomenon.
Yeah, just don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Mises is wrong. The point that he makes in this section is absolutely correct. I just think that it's
Oh
important
yeah,
to make this distinction between, big businesses as a concept, as an economic concept of a large business who provides to a lot of people and thus grows to prominence within the free market, to the existing contemporary large businesses who have become active opponents of capitalism and economic freedom and essentially proto-political organizations.
yeah. I wasn't saying that.
Yeah, no,
Uh,
I was just adding to, my own point. I just don't want to make it sound like I was saying that Mises is wrong because I agree with the point that's being made here.
oh
Yeah.
yeah, I get you.
I just,
Uh,
when this book was published in 1950s, this problem of subversive companies was not nearly as evident as it is today. So that's why he probably did not give the importance to this distinction that we are now giving.
Yeah, it's been addressed since and is being, more light is being shined upon it by, since Rothbard. So,
Yeah.
people that say that libertarians like just defend corporations and we're okay with, all the benefits the state gives them, just basically regurgitate nonsense, from probably just like conservative libertarians, but still defend these corporations.
Right, the libertarian conservatives that you see running around, they're not libertarians, they just don't have another label for their like constitutional conservatism that they owe so much.
Most of them are not conservatives either.
I know this is the crazy thing. So many of them are fucking sodomites and shit.
I'm socially liberal and fiscally conservative.
Dude,
Yep.
I wanna fucking... I'm not even gonna say what I wanna do to people to say that.
It's the most annoying phrase. I don't
Let's just say it sounds like an engine, like a large engine.
I don't care if you actually are personally that. I really don't. Just it's really cringe to hear it being said.
Yeah.
Just keep that to yourself. Like, we get it. That's basically just saying you're a minarchist, which
It's not
whatever.
even minarchist. It's this.
It's saying you're a lowbird.
Yeah. Well, you're saying that you're basically what is impossible, which is you're somehow left culturally, but right economically. The right economically and socially are only two compatible with each other, and one is not compatible with the left version of the other one.
Yeah, this point can be made for the other side as well. You know, the Nazball types, or third positionists even. Not so much the third positionists, because they still agree with a lot of capitalist principles, but especially the, Strasserists and National Bolsheviks, who are, economically far left and socially far right. These things just not compute with each other.
They tend to end up with bricks being thrown into the Cato Institute windows.
Yeah, the socially liberal but physically conservative. But anyways, I think we've gone to the end of our sections, and so we can, wrap it up.
Yeah, we've been going for over 2 hours already too.
Yep.
This was a good discussion.
Yeah, this was a good episode.
Yeah, you guys really did most of the talking this time. Kyle actually had a lot. You actually had a lot to say this time.
Yeah, I mean,
and I just ended up listening.
I finally had time to read the book, so now it had a lot more insight to give than on our previous book. So yeah.
Yep. So.
Yeah, I think this is just a good note to end on, that, if you're going to be a right-winger, and even though I personally have little bit of a, I don't like the normie conception of right and left. I don't think anyone who's not a normie does, but anyways, it's kind of inescapable, so I guess I've just accepted it. But yeah, if you're a right-winger, to me, you kind of have to be a right-winger economically and socially. If you are just one way, not the other, you are eventually going to shift towards becoming just one way or just the other, and more often than not, these people just end up shifting towards being completely left.
Right. Hoppe has written on this. It's in Democracy: The God That Failed. I forget what chapter. And then he also has a talk at the Property and Freedom Society. That is right libertarianism as practical libertarianism. So, if you really want to understand why we think this way, those would be two resources.
Yeah. It's just a good note to end on.
Yep. I'm Colton. I'm at Hetsu very much.
I'm Kyle. I'm at UFFZ Kyle.
I'm Emo, and I'm at Emo Hoppean 346.
Yeah, all of our Twitter handles are on the top right corner off the stream in yellow, so you can just hit us up on Twitter if you want to ask questions about the show, or I have open DMs if you just want to ask questions in general. Just hit me up.
Yep.
And I just want to shill Mises.org for all your libertarian and Hoppian and Misesian reading materials.
Yeah.
No. Shillhoppian.org.
And Hoppian.org.
Yeah, that's our website. And speaking of Hoppean.org, as per tradition, Colton, do you have any updates for us?
I'm not gonna be. Articles are gonna be kind of not be worked on as I watch Mises U. So yeah, sorry about that, guys, but I've got to educate myself before I can, really write more things, and that takes time.
All right.
Has Mises U started yet?
It has.
haven't-
It actually started when we started the stream.
Oh, okay.
So I was going to close this out and then watch the opening remarks as I went to bed.
Okay.
All right.
Alright, well, I guess we're done.
Yep. So,
All right.
wait.
See you,
What
everybody.
are we gonna do next week? Have we decided the chapters?
We're gonna finish up chapter 2 and go into chapter 3.
All right.
The exact details I don't have available to me, but I have put them where we organize stuff.
Okay.
So yeah, we'll communicate that on Twitter. So
Yep. All right. So that's it for tonight, I guess.
yep.
All right. Bye, bye, guys. Good evening.
Good night.
All right.